What's up everyone, welcome to Workshop Rebuild. In today's episode, I'll share with you guys how to reassemble your Sundstrand Series 15 Model 90 inline hydraulic motor. In my previous video on the Sundstrand hydraulic motor, which I have laid out in front of me, I received a whole bunch of positive feedback. You guys gave me a whole bunch of likes, so I understand that you guys are enjoying the videos I share with you guys. I also received many comments and you guys wanted me to rebuild this as soon as possible because you guys probably want to do the exact same thing as me. I will give you guys detailed views on all the parts laid out on the main table, and then I'll share with you guys the products which I'll be using in today's video and the parts which I had to purchase for this rebuild. I have links down in the description on all these parts. I made a spreadsheet for you guys. So I took my time and I wrote down all the O-rings, all the seals, the gaskets, the oil filter. I just listed everything that you need for this rebuild down in the description on one spreadsheet. I will bring you guys straight away to the side table and I'll share with you guys the products and the parts in today's video. On the side table, I have all the parts laid out which I currently purchased for this rebuild. There are less parts involved in the inline motor than there are in the U-pump, which I previously rebuilt on the Sundstrand. I will start from left and I will move on to the right. We have a whole bunch of O-rings and seals, but I will get into it right now. So the first thing I purchased were two radial bearings. These bearings will be for the inlet and the output shaft. These are sealed as of right now because I noticed on the input and the output shafts, they had a little step on each side on the inner and the outer race, and that means those were sealed bearings. Therefore, I purchased the exact same size. I have sealed bearings, but I will take the end cap off on both sides so we have the exact same bearing as the previous ones. These two are Nachi radial bearings, and I have these in the link down in the description. The next thing I purchased was a Wix 51068 hydraulic filter. I choose Wix over any brand, but if you guys prefer John Deere or Fram or anything in that manner, please do so. You just have to make sure that the thread is a proper thread and you have the proper dimensions. So yeah, you guys can cross-reference those numbers down in the description below. The next thing I purchased were two dual lip seals for the trunnion shafts. The trunnion shafts are on the variable swash plate, so that is the shaft where your lever is mounted to for your forward and reverse. These two seals will be on the left and on the right of your hydraulic motor main block. Next up, I have the input shaft seal. I did an error on my end. I didn't even look at it. This is a single lip seal, but you want to purchase a dual lip seal of the exact same size. The size of this seal is down in the description below. I believe it's 3/4 ID, and you really want to make sure that's a dual lip seal. The dual lip seal is technically a duster on the front, which doesn't allow grime to come in, and then the second seal, which is behind, keeps your oil within the hydraulic motor. So I will focus on these O-rings. I did purchase these locally, as I mentioned before, so it's hard for me to find these exact sizes online and share links with you guys. Most of the O-rings that I find are just big assortments of O-rings, so it's hard to really just find single O-rings. Your best bet would be to go out there to a local seal dealer or even a bearing dealer, and they will provide you with these seals as long as you have the correct dimension of O-ring or seal in that manner. The O-rings that I have laid out, and especially the bottom ones here, are just standard hydraulic fitting O-rings. So they have different sizes, and these are just standard to hydraulic fittings. So if you'd go in there and ask for a certain size hydraulic fitting, they'd give you one of these O-rings right here. I won't go in detail on the sizes as the link is below. These are ORB 906s, ORB 910s, and ORB 905. I have 4 of these, 2 of the 3/4 sizes, and 1 of the smallest ones. So we have right here 4, 2, and 1. The biggest O-ring, which is a special O-ring, this is for your Gerotor cover plate, is 85mm by 3mm. This is a specific size. When I went to purchase this O-ring, I took the Gerotor cover plate with me, and they just test fitted the O-rings in there and found this was the correct size. So that is 85mm by 3mm. Off to my far right, I have a couple spring pins. The original pins were roll pins, especially on the inside of the hydraulic motor. I did not find any roll pins, so these right here are spring pins, and like I mentioned, everything is down in the description. So I have 4 of the smaller ones, which will be internally, and the big one, which is 1/4 inch by 1 1/4 long, will hold your lever to your trunnion shaft, which is externally. Next up, I have a hardened dowel pin. This is just a regular length. This is how you can get it at any local hardware store, I believe. So they give you a certain length, and what I do to it, since it's the correct diameter, I just cut it to length. And this hardened shaft will be for your gear pump on the front of your hydraulic motor. So we'll do that later. We'll cut this to size and I'll share with you guys how that works. The next thing that I made myself were 2 gaskets. These 2 gaskets are for both sides of the mid block on the hydraulic motor assembly. So what I first did, I made myself a template out of some scrap material right here. I made sure that all the sizes are correct, especially on the inside of the hydraulic motor. I do not want anything to interfere or block a certain passageway. So the inside diameter is very important. If you keep it a little bit bigger on the outside, it's no big deal. You can just shave it off afterwards. But I made a template first. Then I went ahead and cut it out of proper gasket material. This right here happens to be Velumoid. This is an American brand, and they are very well known for proper gaskets. This has a certain texture to it, and I think it's embedded with a certain material, so it's perfectly fine for hydraulic oils. So I'm finished with all the products I purchased over there on the table. The spreadsheet is down below for you guys to print out. You guys can understand what's involved, and if you guys want to tackle this hydraulic motor rebuild yourself, you guys can do so with the parts I listed. So now let me share with you guys the products in today's video. The products I will be using in today's video are black silicone. I will use this for the gaskets, and I will use this for around some bolts, which I will be installing in today's video. This is a temperature and water resistant silicone, so this will be just perfectly fine. The next thing which I have in front of me is assembly grease. This comes out of the tube as a grease, but once it creates a little bit of friction or it gets hot, it will turn into an oil. So this is great for engines or assemblies which you don't start right away, which will be started very soon. To lube up the internals of the hydraulic motor, I have a little bit of ATF right here. This is automatic transmission fluid, and I have a little brush, if you guys can see that, a little brush, and I will be adding this and dabbing it onto certain parts which need lubrication on the assembly. To clean up the surfaces, I have paint thinner. This will be used for cleaning parts before I merge them with the silicone and or the gaskets. I just shared with you guys the products that I'll be using in today's video for this rebuild, and now let me share with you guys all the parts laid out on this white table. I'm on the far right of the table, and I have the main block in front of me as well as the gear pump cover. The main block is the biggest part on this whole assembly. Most of the parts that you'll see laid out on this table will mount within this main block, and this main block has a whole bunch of threads, so there's a whole bunch that has to get threaded into this main block, and that's why it is the center point of this whole assembly. Looking at it from the bottom, we have the connection and the surface for the external oil filter. We have the threaded adapter, so this threads into the main block housing. After that, we'll add our external oil filter, but that's probably the last thing I will do in this whole assembly. In front of the main block, I have the main shaft. This happens to be the input shaft. You will see the input has the key slot. If you guys do not have a John Deere 400, if it is a different application, you may have a different input shaft. This could be splined as well. On this height of the shaft, we have our main radial bearing. This is for the input shaft. When I had this bearing in my hand and I just turned it slowly, it felt quite good. But then once I spin it a little bit faster, it doesn't feel any good. So I just went ahead and bought 2 new radial bearings for this assembly. If you guys look at the bearing closely, you guys will see a step on the outer and on the inner race. This will tell you that this was a sealed bearing at one point. That's exactly why I purchased 2 sealed bearings, to make them exactly the same. I will just pop out those sidewalls and make sure that the bearings are just like this one. The input shaft has its key. If your key is damaged, you guys will want to replace your key. The bearing is held in place with this snap ring, so once you push on the new bearing, you will lock it in place with this snap ring just in front of it. Looking at the main block from the top, which is this area, we will have 2 fittings, and at the same time we will have room for these 2 plugs. They go in on both sides of the main block, and if you guys would take these out once it's assembled, you guys can test the pressure on the hydraulic motor. You guys can thread in a gauge right here and check your pressure on your hydraulic motor. On the far side of the main block, I have another snap rig. This is for the shaft assembly. So once the bearing is on the shaft, we will mount the shaft inside of this main block, and we will secure it in place with this snap ring. In front of the main block, which is the input area of this main block, we have a smooth surface, and this will allow us to merge our gear pump to the main block. The only function for the gear pump is to pump oil for your valve block, and that will be for your accessories on your machine. The gear pump mounts on the top of the main block, just like so. You want to make sure that everything is nice and clean when you assemble this. The gear on the gear pump is then hooked up to the main shaft just by this little hardened pin right here. Once everything is in place, you can then go ahead and take your cover for the gear rotor and gear pump, add your O-ring, which is the biggest O-ring, 85mm by 3mm. Then you can take your cover and mount it the correct way. There are 2 ways you can mount this: LH, which is facing upward, or RH. If your motor is left-hand turning, then you want to have this on the top of your hydraulic motor. If it is right-hand turning, you want to have it on the top of the motor. In our case, for the John Deere 400, it is on the top of the motor, so it will be mounted this way. Once the cover is in place, you can then add 4 bolts around the perimeter and everything will be locked in place. I just shared with you guys the main block and the front gear pump for the auxiliary hydraulics. Now I'll move ahead and share with you guys what's inside the main block and move to the other side of the hydraulic motor. So the camera is focused on the middle of the table and then moving forward to the main block, which is on the far right. This main block separates your pump, which is the front portion of your hydraulic motor, to the motor side, which is the rear side of your hydraulic motor. When we look at it from the front, we will have the mid block, which is facing this way. We have 2 ball bearings right here, and from the back you guys can remove these 2 flathead screws if you guys would like to open that up. I did not, because these ball bearings still move perfectly with the springs which are behind it. On this surface right here, I will be adding one of those gaskets I cut out, and I will be adding 2 O-rings in these locations. Above the mid block, I have 2 plugs as well. So when I share with you guys those 2 areas, they are right here and right here. These 2 plugs will thread in, but I will do that later on. From the mid block to the main block, all these parts right here are within the main block. This right here happens to be the variable swash plate. So what this does is you have 2 shafts on either side, left and right. These are called trunnion shafts. Down in the description, I have seals, and those 2 seals will be on the side of the trunnion shaft. These are very important. These hook up to the variable swash plate and allow you to rock your hydraulic pump up and down. And what that does is it allows the pump to change direction. That will then allow your machine to go in forward or in reverse. Within the variable swash plate, we have this washer. This was the top end of the washer when I took it apart, and this was the bottom end. If you do have wear or damage on your washer, you can just flip it around to the smooth side. But looking at the front side, there's no damage and there are no grooves whatsoever. So I will be placing it back inside the variable swash plate just like that. Looking at these two shafts, it is also very important to make sure that there is no damage on them in any way. There is a little bit of discoloration on these shafts right here, but I'm not too worried about that. These are still perfectly fine and they measure perfect as well. When the seal is installed on both sides of these trunnion shafts, we have covers for both of those seals, and they are just washers. You want to make sure that these are also cleaned up and that there is no burr on the inside of this washer, because that's where the dual lip seal will be, and you do not want that seal to get damaged if there would be a burr right here. On the right of the hydraulic motor, hooked up to the bigger side of the trunnion shaft, we have our lever function. What this allows us to do on the John Deere 400 is our linkage hooks up to this, our trunnion shaft is mounted within this bore, and it's held in place with one of our spring pins. Once we activate it with our lever, it will allow us to go forward and backward, and that will then change the direction of the pump. Looking at the variable swash plate and the washer, which is laid down inside, we have our barrel assembly and our valve. This barrel assembly is the key component with the valve to this whole assembly, and you really want to make sure that all of these parts are perfectly clean once you reassemble them. And not just clean, they have to be lubed up, and you want to make sure that when you install all these parts that everything is nicely lubed up. You don't have to over lube it, but everything is lubed up and it has a coating. So every piece of metal that touches another piece, you want to have lubed up. But for now, I'll share with you guys the barrel assembly. This happens to have 8 pistons. So all these bores right here act like a cylinder on an engine. Then we have the pistons, which are these assemblies right here. And once this turns in the pump, it will act just like a cylinder within an engine. It will compress and push oil through those little bores down below and create high pressure to then power the motor, which is in the back of this hydraulic motor. Another key feature on this whole assembly are the valves. This right here is a stationary part, and the barrel assembly is what rotates. Once these parts merge, just like this part is rotating and the valve is stationary. When you look at the valve for the hydraulic pump, which is the front portion of the motor, will have 2 whales. Those whales are little cutouts on this valve, and that is very important for the pump. When we look at this assembly, and this barrel will turn and the pistons will move up and down, it will create pressure and the oil will get pushed through these openings and get transferred through the mid block to the hydraulic motor. So I shared with you guys the barrel assembly and I shared with you guys the valve. I will share with you guys now how I finished this surface to make it really shiny and make it like new again. You want to take your valve and you want to run your fingernail over the surface. If you feel any damage over that surface, a groove or any slight imperfection, you want to grab yourself a very fine emery cloth. Emery cloth is not sandpaper. You want to make sure it's emery cloth, and you want to take a very high grit number. You want to then take your emery cloth, lay it on a flat piece of glass, plexiglass, or even a very flat surface of metal. You really want to make sure it's perfectly flat. Then you can tape it down on all corners to make sure that it does not move on you. You want to make your surface wet. My best practice was to take the valve, do not apply pressure from the top, just let the weight from the part grind on the emery cloth. I then drew a figure 8. After a couple of minutes, you should notice a big difference on the surface that you're lapping in on the emery cloth. It should be shinier and it should be much smoother. If your part still has a little groove or a little imperfection in it, you should keep on going and do not apply pressure. Just let the pressure of the part touch the emery cloth. After a couple of minutes, you should have an even surface and you should not have any imperfections anymore. If your surface looks just like mine, you're ready to put this back together, but you really want to make sure that everything is clean after you have done the lapping process. I shared with you guys the lapping process on the pump valve, and now I'll move ahead and share with you guys the parts from the mid block to the end block. Now I'll share with you guys everything from the mid block back. I have 5 fittings right here. 3 happen to be elbow fittings. These 2 are for your auxiliary hydraulics. These go on top of the main block. We have 2 end plugs. These are probably for accessories for different machines, but in our case for the John Deere 400, they just plug these bores off. The biggest elbow fitting is for your pickup line, and that will be on the bottom of the hydraulic motor. For these 5 fittings right here, I have new O-rings and I will be installing those very soon. Right behind the mid block, I have the exact same assembly like I have in front of it. This is a barrel assembly once again, but this is the barrel assembly for the motor side of the hydraulic motor. The same thing is over here, a valve, and this valve is a little bit special. It has 4 whales around the perimeter, so you guys can see 4 cutouts, and you want to make sure that this valve is behind the mid block. The one with 2 whales is in front, so that's very important. The barrel assembly consists of the exact same mechanism as in front. We have 8 pistons and 1 barrel, which will accommodate 8 pistons as well. I don't have to go through that. That's the exact same thing. So the power gets transferred through the mid block hydraulically and powers the rear barrel, which then hooks up to the output shaft. This output shaft has a spline on the outside, which will hold the toothed bevel gear to then transfer power to our rear end on the John Deere 400. On this output shaft, I have a radial bearing once again. Like I mentioned before, they were spinning just fine, but as you spin them faster, they don't feel as good as they should, so I went ahead and replaced them. This radial bearing will be placed in this area right here. We will then add our beveled gear, and then we will cap everything off with the snap ring. On the far left of the white table, I have the end block. When you look around the perimeter of this end block, we have 4 bolt holes. John Deere only used 4 of them to mount to the rear end. Inside of this rear block, the inside diameter of this rear block has 1 angle on it, not like the variable swash plate. This is a stationary swash plate and it always stays on 1 angle. It's hard to share with you guys, but it's going down on 1 angle. Once again, we have a washer. On both sides of this washer, you want to make sure that the surface is clean and there is no groove. If there is imperfection or damage on your washer, you would want to replace it. In my case, I can still reuse this. Even the top surface, which was facing the barrel assembly, it is still perfect, but if you guys have a feeling it might not be the best, you guys can always flip this around. To hold the end block to the mid block and then screw everything together to the main block, which is in front, we have these long bolts. We have 4 which will get inserted around the perimeter, and these get inserted from the back. So when we push them in, we have enough room for our mid block, and then the tip of this bolt will screw in to the front block. I've done enough talking now. Let me get right to the assembly process of this Sundstrand Series 15 inline hydraulic motor. The first thing I will be doing is grabbing both bearings. These are the brand new bearings. The bigger radial ball bearing will mount onto the output shaft. The smaller radial bearing will mount onto the input shaft. What I did right here, I took off the side covers on the bearing. For that, I just took a pick, I put it on the inside diameter, and lifted that up. I will not need these for this assembly. So just like that, I'm going to head over to the press and push these two bearings onto the input and the output shaft. Since I'm already on the press, I will take the two shaft seals for the trunnion shafts, take the main block and insert the shaft seal straight away with the same method over there on the arbor press. Since I pushed on the bearing onto the output shaft, I will grab the rear end housing. I will flip it around like this. This is exactly where the rear shaft will mount into. I will push it in from the bottom, just like that. I'm gonna make sure that it's already centered. I'm gonna push it in by hand. Does not go in by hand any further. I will have to go over to the press. I'm back from the press and you guys can see the bearing is now in place. There is enough room to add the first snap ring that will go into this groove along the outside diameter of the bearing.
Just like that, the snap ring is installed.
I can now add the output gear. So I just installed the output shaft into the end block. Now I can go ahead and mount the input shaft into the main block, which is the front. Next up, I will install the variable swash plate with the two trunnion shafts on either side. You want to make sure that the longer trunnion shaft is on the side where the lever is, which is the left side of the housing. This right here is exactly the same, so forward or backward has the exact same angle on this inline pump. But when I took it apart, I did mark this as the top end. So I will make sure that the top faces the top of the hydraulic motor. I will grab all four spring pins. For the spring pins, I will need one punch at least to punch it in, but I will grab another two punches to locate the trunnion shaft to the variable swash plate. Not to forget, on both sides of the trunnion shafts, we have both washers which act as a seal for the outside dual lip seals. So without further ado, let me install all of this here. halfway through the hydraulic motor rebuild. If you enjoy the content you're seeing, please hit that like button down below. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, as I will have a whole bunch of how-to videos in the near future and always work on some new machines. So without further ado, let's get right back to the hydraulic motor rebuild. So I managed to add the barrel assembly onto the main block. The pump is finished for now. Next up, I'll move on to the rear block and I'll merge that with the mid block. For that, I'll need silicone and the gasket I made. I have to make sure everything stays together by hand, and then I'll mount that onto the main block, which is right there. So it's going to be a little bit tricky, but I hope I can share with you guys the proper angles. It's just like the teardown, just the opposite. Instead of taking it apart, we're going to have to merge it, and then we're going to have to tighten 4 bolts. So stick around. I successfully mounted the barrel assembly to the rear and the front blocks. Now I'll go ahead and clean up the mid block with the paint thinner. I'll clean up all surfaces where the gasket will touch with paint thinner. Then I'll go ahead and add a little bit of silicone around the perimeter. It has to be the thinnest amount, because if you add too much, it will go inside the pump and you do not want that. You want to just take a little bit on your finger and smear around the perimeter where the gasket will sit. On one side of the mid block, we will add 2 O-rings, and I will give you guys a close-up view on that. Since the silicone dries quite fast, I'm going to have to merge it right away together. So I'll do my best to share that with you guys. One thing I'd like to share before I add the gaskets with silicone onto the mid block. The mid block has these dowel pins on both sides. They're facing the top end of the hydraulic motor. When we look at this end, I marked the top. The top usually has a little bit more material. So these grooves in your valves, you want to make sure that they are facing upward. So when you merge these two halves, the dowel pin will sit within this groove of the valve. Same thing on the main block. This groove should be facing upward on the pump. This is the top end of the pump. That dowel pin should lie right in that groove once these parts are merged. The 2 O-rings that I have will be placed around the ball bearings inside the mid block, and 2 gaskets will be for the right and the left side of this housing. You want to make sure that the parts internally are oiled up or lubed up, and when you add the gasket with your silicone around the perimeter, that the oil does not touch the silicone, especially during the drying time. The hydraulic motor is back together as one unit, but I still have to add some accessories here and there, as well as the front gear motor. So let me share with you guys how to install that. Laid out on the table are the last parts I have to install onto the hydraulic motor. Next up will be the gear pump cover with the gear pump which is up above. A special part and a very important part for the gear pump is this pin. This pin will transfer power from the main shaft to the gear of the gear pump. I will give you guys a close-up on this used shaft. You guys will see a flat spot right there. There's a flat spot on that pin, as well as on the other side. Right there, there is a flat spot. I will not let this pin pass my rebuild. So what I did, I went ahead and grabbed a hardened pin of the same diameter, but it is much longer. So what I will have to do right now is cut it to length, and then I will grind it down to the specific length of this pin. If you guys can find this pin in the correct size, that's great, but you guys can just go grab a standard industrial pin, which is the same diameter, and cut it to length yourself to achieve the same length as the original. So I finished up the brand new pin. It is to size and it fits within the gear of the gear pump just perfectly. So now let me install the gear on the face of the hydraulic motor. mounting the Deere pump cover. I know the seal wasn't in the picture. I do have the wrong one, but I will replace that very soon. Now I'll move ahead to the fittings. I'll add all the O-rings onto the fittings and merge them to the hydraulic motor. Once that's done, I can add the minor touches and I'll share everything with you guys. If you guys made it this far in the video, I want to thank you a bunch for watching through until this point. It's no joke to just watch for such a long time, but if you guys have this rebuild yourself, I hope this video will help you out there. I successfully rebuilt this hydraulic motor. There wasn't anything really tricky with this inline pump. I found the U pump was a little bit trickier than this one, but that's just my personal experience. I just finished mounting the fittings. Everything went on super smooth. I did not tighten them up perfectly because I still have to align them with the hydraulic lines which are on the machine. So I will tighten them up once the hydraulic lines are fitted to the fittings. I mounted the lever which activates the forward and reverse that is held in place with one spring pin. I did not add the hydraulic oil filter as of yet and the hydraulic oil filter adapter either. I will mount this once the rear end is fully assembled. I will add the hydraulic oil filter once the rear end is completely assembled. As well as the input shaft key, I left that away because since it has been loose now and I put it in the shaft, I might just lose it again. So these three parts I will leave for another day. Please smash that like button down below if you guys enjoyed this video. It gives me feedback if I'm doing a good job on the videos, and leave a comment if you guys have any questions on the hydraulic motor rebuild or something I missed. And if you guys want to be up to date with all my upcoming videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So stay tuned.